The tide had turned an hour before dawn, and the river was giving up its secrets to the cold. A boy of 9 stood in the mud to his knees, his bare feet blue beneath the water, his fingers searching for the shape of a nail, a bone, a scrap of copper. The gaslights on London Bridge burned yellow through the fog, and the air smelled of coal smoke, of tar, of the sweetness of something dead. He worked without speaking. Behind him, an old woman bent almost double, her shawl heavy with wet, her basket knocking softly against her hip. The bells of St. Magnus struck 5, and no one looked up. The Thames took what it wanted from them, and it gave back only what it no longer needed. And so the morning began. The river before the city. Good evening, and welcome. This is the Bedside Historian, and the night is yours. Wherever you are listening tonight, whether it is late in one corner of the world, or already turning toward morning on the other side of it, I am glad you are here. Tell me, in the hush of wherever you are, what hour it is on your side of the dark. Is the window open? Is the room warm? Are the lamps low? Whatever the time, settle in. There is nowhere you need to be for the next while, and nothing you need to carry. If you find comfort in these long tellings, I would ask you to subscribe to the channel. Give the video a like if the mood suits you. It is a simple thing, and it helps the channel grow, and it means more of these nights can be made for you. That is all I will ask of you. The rest of the hour is yours. Tonight, we are going back to a river. Not a river you would recognize, though the name has not changed. The Thames, as we are about to see it, belonged to a different city, a different century, and a different sort of person. It ran black. It smelled of coal, of tar, of the sweetness of things you would not want named aloud. And at low tide, in the hours before the bridges above had woken, there were people down in the mud of it, children mostly, and a few widowed women. Once in a while, a man whose luck had run out on higher ground. They were called Mudlarks, and we are going to spend this hour with them. The year is 1850, or 1852, or 1855. The date does not much matter, because the river had been the same for a lifetime, and would be the same for another 20 years. It is 3 in the morning, and the tide has turned. The Thames is a broad grey-black thing beneath the fog, running west to east, drawing itself away from the walls of the wharves as it does twice a day, every day, whether or not the city cares to notice. The gaslights are burning on London Bridge. They burn on Blackfriars and on Southwark too, yellow globes hanging in the mist, and their reflections lie broken on the water, like coins spilled on a table. The bells of St. Magnus the Martyr, the church that stands at the north end of London Bridge, will ring 5 in a little while. Below the bridge, at a set of stone steps worn smooth by 3 centuries of feet, a figure has already come down onto the foreshore. She is old. How old, the parish register does not say, and she probably could not have said herself, for the poor of that century rarely knew the year of their own birth to within 5 years either way. She wears a shawl that was once black, and is now the colour of the mud she works in. Her feet are bare, the basket rests on her hip, and she carries a stick with a hooked iron end that she will use to turn the stones and to fish out anything the river has decided to give up. Her name is not written down anywhere, and so she goes into this hour without one, as most of them did. She does not look up when a boy of 9 comes down the same steps behind her. He is barefoot too, though the cold this morning is such that the mud will burn the skin like a coal for the first minute, and then take the feeling from the toes altogether, which is in its way a mercy. His shirt hangs loose over trousers cut down from a man's pair, tied at the waist with a length of tarred rope. There is no basket in his hands. What he carries is a tin can that once held cocoa, and it now holds whatever he can find. Further along the shore, other shapes are stepping down out of the fog. A girl of 7 with her hair tied back by a strip of cloth. 2 brothers who work as a pair. A woman with a baby wrapped inside her shawl, who will keep to the drier parts because she cannot risk the child in the deeper mud. None of them speak. There is nothing to be said at this hour, and speaking wastes breath. We ought to pause here, you and I, and look properly at what the river was. The Thames of that century was not the Thames of ours. It was, first of all, an open sewer. Every one of the 2.5 million people who lived in London, by the middle of the 1850s, poured their waste into it, by way of the cesspits that emptied into the drains and the drains that emptied into the water. It received the runoff from the slaughterhouses of Smithfield, the tanneries of Bermondsey, the gasworks, the breweries, the dye yards, the boneyards and the soap makers. It carried the ash of 100,000 coal fires and the dead of every kind of animal the city had done with. Two great buried rivers, the Fleet and the Walbrook, ran into it out of sight, from underneath the streets. Cattle carcasses were sometimes seen floating past the tower. In the summer of 1858, the smell would grow so terrible that Parliament itself would have to soak its curtains in chloride of lime to sit, and would then pass, in a matter of weeks, the bill that would build Joseph Bazalgette's great sewer system. That is the summer we know as the Great Stink, and we will come to it in its proper place. But in the hours before dawn, before all of that had begun for the day, the river was calmer than any other part of the city. The great trade of the port had not yet started. The lightermen who worked the barges were asleep in their lodgings on the south bank. The customs men had not yet come down to the quays. The only sound on the water was the creak of a moored hull and the drip of the tide leaving the timber. On to the foreshore then. The mud of the Thames was not the mud of any river a country boy who came down to London to look for work would have seen. It was a deep, black, oily thing, thickened by 2,000 years of the city's rubbish. It ate the leather of boots. Rope rotted in it. A man's foot could sink to the calf, and if the tide came back before you had pulled yourself free, that was the end of you. The Mudlarks knew where to walk. They knew, without being told, which stretches were firm and which stretches would swallow them, because a child who did not learn that in the first winter did not see a second. They kept to the shallower shelves. The barges gave them a path to follow. Along the stones of the causeways that ran out from the old stairs they picked their way, reading the water the way a shepherd reads a hill. What they were looking for was less romantic than a story about a river ought to be. They were looking for coal. That was the first and most important thing. Coal fell from the barges as they were unloaded at the wharves, and every lump a mudlark found could be sold for a farthing or two, and a farthing was a good part of a meal. After coal came copper nails, prized out of the timbers of old boats that had been broken up on the shore, because copper fetched a fair price at the metal dealers of the East End. Rope was worth a trade too, cut into short lengths and sold to the caulkers who worked on the boats. Old iron went into the basket, and lead, and bones for the bone mills, which bought them by the pound to be crushed for fertilizer. Rag came in. So did anything else the rag and bone shops on Rosemary Lane might weigh out and pay for. I want to be honest with you here. The record of what a mudlark could earn in a day is uneven, because the record was made by men who came down to the river with notebooks and asked, and the mudlarks knew better than to tell strangers the truth about their pockets. Henry Mayhew, who walked the foreshore for his great survey of London's poor in the year 1850, was told by one boy that on a bad day he took home a penny, on an average day threepence, and on a good day sixpence or eightpence. Others told him less. One or two claimed more. The truth was that any given tide might give you a shilling's worth of coal or might give you nothing at all, and you went home wet either way. Let me stay with that arithmetic a moment, because it is worth knowing what threepence would buy for a family in that year. A 4-pound loaf of bread cost around 7p. A quart of milk was 4p. A pound of the cheapest cut of meat, if any meat was had at all, was 5p or 6p. So a boy who came home with 3p had brought home something under half of the day's bread for a household of 5, and no more. And there would be no meat that week from what he had earned. The rent on a single room in a Wapping tenement ran between 1 shilling and half a crown a week. And if the rent was not paid, the family was on the street. That is the arithmetic the mudlarks were working with, hour by hour, in the mud. You have to picture the light, or the lack of it. This is not a river lit by anything you would call proper illumination. The gas globes on the bridges throw a yellow that dies within a stone's throw of the parapet, and by the time it reaches the water, it is only a stain. There is no lamp on the foreshore itself, none on the stairs either. The mudlarks work by starlight when the sky is clear, and by nothing at all when it is not, and they find what they find with their fingers rather than their eyes. A copper nail, sunk half buried in the ooze, is a shape that a hand learns to feel. A lump of coal has an edge to it. A bone has a smoothness. The foreshore, before the sun came up, was a country read by touch. The tide was the clock. It fell for 6 hours and rose for 6, and the foreshore they worked was theirs only for the falling of it and the low water at the bottom. As soon as the river began to come back in, they had to be off. A rising Thames at London Bridge in the middle of the century could come in at 3 miles an hour, and the shelving mud at Bankside or Wapping could be under a foot of water in the time it took to walk back to the stairs. Children were lost to it every year. The Dredgermen, whom we will meet in a later chapter, pulled the bodies out for the parish shilling. The bridges above them were not the bridges of the modern city either. London Bridge, in the middle of that century, was the newer one built by John Rennie in 1831, in place of the old medieval bridge, with its shops and houses that had stood for 600 years. A little upstream, Southwark Bridge crossed the water in iron and grey, though it charged a toll and so the poor did not use it. Blackfriars stood in its second form, the Rennie one. The great new bridge we know today would not be built until 1869. Waterloo carried its 9 arches across the tide. Westminster was still the 18th century bridge, sagging by then, and shortly to be pulled down. Under all of them the tide moved without complaint, and along the walls beneath them the mudlarks worked. The name Mudlark itself has an uncertain origin. It appears in print by 1785, in a piece about the river scavengers of London, and it seems to have been slang for a long while before that. Whether it was first used by the mudlarks themselves or given to them by others is not recorded. It sits somewhere between mockery and description. A lark was a bird, and it was also a game or a piece of foolery, and to call the poorest work on the poorest river a lark had a bitter sort of humour to it that people of that century enjoyed. For our purposes, then, the mudlarks of the 1850s are what we are here for. They are not the mudlarks of the 18th century, who had been mostly grown men, watermen fallen on hard times, or convicts working out their sentences on the foreshore. Nor are they the mudlarks of our own day, who go down to the river with permits and metal detectors, looking for Roman coins and Tudor pins as a hobby. The mudlarks of the middle of Queen Victoria's reign were the very poorest of the poor of the largest city in the world, and almost all of them were children, or the mothers and grandmothers of children, and they were on the river because they had nothing else. We are going to spend the next hour on the foreshore with them. The children we will meet first, because there were more children than any other kind of mudlark, and because their days had a rhythm to them that shaped everything else. Beside them, the widowed and elderly women who worked the same tide. We will follow the trade of what they found and where they sold it, and we will sit with them through the great sickness of 1858, when the river itself killed a good many of them without needing to move from its bed. But first, in this hour, we are going to stay right where we are, in the fog, on the foreshore beneath London Bridge, in the last hour before the city wakes up. The tide is still going out. The old woman is bent to her basket, and the boy is turning a stone with his fingers. And further along the shore, a girl of 7 has just picked up a piece of coal the size of a walnut and put it into her apron. The gaslights are burning yellow, fog holds close to the water, the bells of St. Magnus are about to strike 5, and the river, as it has done since long before any of them were born, is giving up its secrets to the poor. In a little while, the sky will begin to lighten over the East End. The barges will start to move, the watermen will come down to the quays with their long oars, and the great trade of the port will begin its day. And then the mudlarks will scatter, because the working river was no place for them once it had woken. But for now, in this last hour of the tide, they have the foreshore to themselves, and it is the children among them we ought to meet first. The children of the foreshore. Let me draft Chapter 2 now, keeping continuity with the hook, and Chapter 1, while shifting focus to the children. Come with me now, away from the woman with the basket, and along the shore about 100 yards to the east. It is still that same hour before dawn, and the fog has not lifted. What I want you to see is what she is walking towards, though she will never quite reach it herself, because she works her own patch and the children work theirs. There are perhaps a dozen of them, spread out along the shelf of mud that runs down from Billingsgate towards the tower stairs. The eldest is a girl of about 11, and the youngest is a boy who cannot be more than 6. He is her brother, or so she tells anyone who asks, though the parish would not have been able to say for certain. His name, in the surveys that Henry Mayhew wrote up in the year 1850, would have been recorded as Tom, or Jem, or Bill, because those were the names half the boys on the Foreshore had, and no one on the river ever asked for a surname. The girl carries a wooden pail with a rope handle. The boy has nothing at all in his hands, only the deep pockets of a coat that must once have belonged to a grown man. It hangs down past his knees. The sleeves are rolled and stitched at the cuffs. Where the pockets sag, the lining has been mended with sacking, and inside them, by the end of a good tide, he can carry 3 pounds of coal and a fistful of copper without spilling any of it as he walks. They came down from Rosemary Lane, most of them. Some came from further up, from the courts behind Wapping High Street, or from the tenements at Shadwell, or from the rookeries at St. Giles, though the ones from St. Giles had the longest walk, and were the most tired by the time they reached the water. A few came from over the river, from the alleys behind Bankside, and they crossed London Bridge on foot in the dark, because the toll on Southwark Bridge was a halfpenny, and a halfpenny was a meal. I want to tell you about their homes, because that is where the day started and where it ended, and because the Foreshore only makes sense once you have seen what they were going back to. A room in a Wapping tenement in the year 1850 was seldom more than 10 feet by 12. It held a family of 6, sometimes 8. The walls ran with damp because the river was on one side and the drains were on the other, and the plaster came off in your hand if you leaned on it. There was one window, glazed if the family was lucky, boarded with sacking if not. In one corner stood a straw pallet for the parents, and in the other a heap of rags for the children. A cooking pot hung over a fire that used the coal the children had brought home, and if there was no coal there was no fire, and if there was no fire there was no supper, because a raw potato is not a meal. Rent on such a room was 1 shilling and 6pence a week. On a good week the father might bring in 10 shillings from the docks, unloading tea from the warehouses of St. Catherine's, or timber from the Baltic yards, but the docks did not want him every day, and on the days they did not want him the children's pennies were the whole of what came in. That is why a boy of 6 was on the Foreshore at 5 in the morning, not because his mother did not love him, because the alternative was that no one in the room ate that evening. I have to be careful here and say what is not known. The record does not tell us what most of these children looked like, because no one photographed them. There are 2 or 3 plates from the 1870s, made by street photographers with long exposures, and a handful of drawings by Gustave Doré and by the artists who worked with Mayhew, and that is nearly all. What they were called, what they said to each other, whether they laughed on the shore or worked in silence, whether the older girl I have just described was truly a sister to the youngest boy, or only the closest thing he had to one, none of this survives. What survives is the mud, and the accounts of the men with notebooks, and the weight of coal at the metal dealer's scales. We have to work from that, and from what the river itself will tell us if we stand quietly beside it. The boy of 6 is called down to the water by the girl. She has found a length of tarred rope, half buried, and she needs him to help her draw it out without breaking it, because a length of rope that comes up whole will fetch 2pence at the rag shop, and a length that comes up in 3 pieces will fetch a farthing. He wades in to his ankles. The mud takes the feeling from his toes at once, and he does not flinch, because he learned in his first week that flinching wastes time. Together they pull. The rope comes up in one long dripping line, 13 feet of it by the girl's rough measure, and she coils it around her forearm and lays it across her shoulder like a sash. Further along the shore, 2 brothers of about 9 and 10 are working a stretch of shingle beneath the wall of the custom house. They are looking for nails. The barges that come in to unload at the quays are patched and repatched with copper spikes, and when the timbers rot, the spikes work loose and drop into the shallows, and a barefoot boy who knows where to walk can bring up a dozen in an hour. Copper was fetching between 8pence and 1 shilling a pound at the yards on Cable Street in that decade, and a dozen good spikes might weigh close to £1. and so an hour's work at the right pitch was worth more than a day's work at the wrong one. This is why the older children guarded their pitches. This is why a strange child who came down to the foreshore and worked a stretch that was not his own would be driven off with stones. You do not start with the nails, you start with the coal. That was the rule the older children taught the younger ones. Coal was the surest find, and coal was the household's fire, and if you brought home no coal you were beaten with the strap and sent to bed hungry, and no amount of copper made up for it. So a boy who came down at 5 in the morning began by walking the tide line where the barges had passed the day before, picking up the lumps that had fallen out of the last unloading. Only when his pockets or his tin had their weight of coal did he turn to the harder work of the nails and the bones and the rope. They ate, when they ate at all, on the shore. The girl of 11 kept a heel of bread wrapped in a rag in the bottom of her pail, and she broke off a piece for the boy of 6 when the light began to come up over the east end, and the two of them chewed it slowly, standing in the ooze, watching the barges start to move on the river above them. Bread with nothing on it, made from the coarsest flour, of the sort a baker on Cable Street would sell at 3 halfpence the half loaf. Sometimes there was dripping, sometimes there was nothing. There was almost never tea, because tea meant a kettle and a fire and a mother who had the time to boil the water, and the mothers of the Mudlarks were most often at the wash-house or the match factory in that hour. Their clothes were of a kind that is hard to picture now. Boys of 6 or 7 on the foreshore wore whatever the household had cut down for them. Trousers of moleskin or of the heaviest sacking, cinched at the waist with rope. A shirt that had been a father's and now hung to the knees. A cap, if there was a cap. Girls wore a skirt that had been shortened by tearing and re-hemming, and above it a bodice or a shawl, and beneath it, in the coldest weeks, a second skirt made of anything that would hold shape. None of them wore shoes. Shoes on the foreshore were destroyed within a fortnight, and a pair of shoes cost more than a family could put aside in a month, and so the children went barefoot, and the soles of their feet became a kind of leather by the second winter. You cannot see any of this in a picture. That is one of the mercies of a story told by ear. In your mind you are building it out of what I say, and you can put whatever face on that boy of 6 you like, and you will not be corrected by a photograph. The dangers of the work were not the dangers a country visitor would have guessed at. It was not the tide most of the time, though the tide killed enough of them. It was the cuts. The foreshore was full of broken glass and rusted iron, and the jagged copper of the spikes themselves, and a child who worked barefoot in the mud cut his feet a dozen times in a week, and the mud carried into every cut the whole city's waste. Blood poisoning took more of them than drowning did. A boy who came home in the morning with a cut on the sole of his foot, and could not remember when he had done it, might, by the following Sunday, be lying on his straw pallet with a fever and a swollen leg, and the parish surgeon, if he came at all, would come only to say that the leg would have to be cut off, and by then it was too late for even that. Tetanus was called lockjaw, and no one on the river needed the word explained to them. They worked, at the deepest, in perhaps 2 feet of water. Any deeper, and the tide was still going down, and would not have exposed the shelf yet, or was already coming back and would take them. 2 feet was the height of a 6-year-old's chest, and so the youngest were always the closest to going under. The older children kept an eye on them, most of the time. That is not sentimental, it was practical. A boy who drowned was a boy whose earnings you would have to make up out of your own pockets that evening, and the mothers of the foreshore did not distinguish between their own children and the ones who had been sent down under the older girl's care. By 6:30, the sky over Wapping was showing grey. By 7, the light was strong enough that a man on London Bridge could see the water below him, and the customs officers had begun to come down to the quays, and the lightermen were pushing off from the moorings with their long sweeps and calling to each other across the tide. The children knew this hour by ear. They did not need to look up. The moment the first calls came off the water, they moved. Up the stairs, away from the wharves, because the working river was no place for a barefoot child, once the men who owned the barges had come down to them. The girl of 11, with 13 feet of tarred rope across her shoulder and a pail heavy with coal at her side, climbed the stairs at Custom House with the boy of 6 behind her. His pockets sagged with what he had gathered. On the top step she stopped and counted, quickly, under her breath, in the way a shopkeeper counts a till. 11 pounds of coal, near enough, a double handful of copper spikes, the rope, 2 small bones, and a length of iron. She did not know the exact prices to the farthing, but she knew, by long habit, what the pile as a whole would fetch at the yards on Rosemary Lane, and she calculated it at somewhere around 9p, perhaps 10p if the rope buyer was in a fair mood. 9p was 2/3 of the day's rent. It was 2 loaves of the coarsest bread. It was a night in which the household would eat, and would have a fire, and would sleep on the straw with something in the belly. It was, for a girl of 11 and a boy of 6, an entire morning's worth of standing in mud that had eaten the feeling from their feet, in fog that had put a chill in their lungs they would carry for 2 days, in the cold before the world was awake. They set off up the alley towards Lower Thames Street. Behind them, one by one, the other children were climbing up out of the foreshore, their fines knocking softly in their tins and their pails. The 2 brothers who had worked the custom house shingle went east towards the tenements at Shadwell. A girl with a shawl full of bones went west, towards the bone mill at Millwall. The youngest, the boy of 6, held the older girl's hand, and neither of them looked back at the river. I want you to notice that no one has said a word yet, in this hour. That is not because the children had nothing to say, it is because the foreshore was work, and the walk home was thought, and the mouths were shut against the cold. The talk began later, in the yard behind the rag shop, when the fines were being weighed and the money was being counted out into small brown palms. But before we go with them to that yard, and before we hear what a pound of copper actually fetched from the man behind the scales, there is another figure on the foreshore we have not yet met. She has been there since the tide first turned, working her own stretch, further along the shore than the children ever went. She is not one of them, and she does not want their pitch. She is a woman of 60 or 70, and the river has been her livelihood for longer than any child of 11 has been alive. She is bent almost double at the water's edge. Her basket is heavier than the girl's pail. She is not looking for coal, or not only for coal. What she is looking for is older and stranger, and it takes a lifetime on the foreshore to know where to find it. The tide is still going out. The sky over the east end has turned the colour of pewter. The bells of St. Magnus have struck 7, and the first barges are moving on the river. The children have gone up into the alleys, and the old woman is still down in the shallows, and it is her hour now, in the greying light, alone with what the Thames will show her. The old women of the tide. She was not looking down where the children had looked. Her eyes were on the higher rack line, where the last tide had left a thin dark ribbon of scum and straw and splinter, and where, if you knew what you were doing, the small things that had drifted furthest were caught. A brass button, a pewter spoon with the bowl bent almost flat, the rim of a broken clay pipe, a halfpenny worn so smooth you could not read the Queen's face on it, though the copper was still copper, and would still weigh out at the yard for the same as any other lump of the same size. This is what her 60 years on the river had taught her to look for, and it was not what a child of 6 could have found in a lifetime. Her name, in one of the notebooks kept by the men who came down with questions, was written as Mrs. Fowler, though the note beside it says the writer was not sure of the spelling and had asked her twice. She was the widow of a Wapping lighterman who had drowned in the year 1834, when she was 35 years old, and she had come down to the foreshore in the week after his funeral because there was nothing else to be done, and she was still coming down 26 years later. She had 4 children when he died. 3 of them lived to grow up. 2 of them, a son and a daughter, sent her a shilling a week from the north when they could, and the third, another son, was at sea and was heard from once a year if at all. That shilling a week, when it came, paid her rent. What she found in the mud paid for everything else. I want to sit with her a moment because she is the sort of person the record almost lost. There is one line about her in Mayhew, and there is a note in a parish register that gives her age in 1851 as 52, and there is a burial entry that may or may not be hers from the year 1863. That is the whole of what 170 years have kept of a life. Everything else we are guessing at, and I want you to know that we are guessing. What we know for certain is that women like her worked the tide. There were, by the count of one of the missionaries who kept records in the parish of St. John Wapping in the 1850s, perhaps 40 or 50 of them along the north bank between the Tower and Limehouse Reach on any given morning of the year, and probably as many on the south side between Bermondsey and Rotherhithe. They were widows almost to a woman. A few had husbands who had gone to the colonies and had not come back. One or two had never married and had been on the shore since girlhood and had grown old there. They were, on the whole, older than 50 and younger than 70, though a scattering of them were older still. They kept their own pitches well apart from the children, because the finds they were after were of a different kind and needed a stretch of shore that had not been picked over by 12 pairs of bare feet. The pitch Mrs. Fowler had chosen for herself that morning ran from the eastern side of the Custom House Quay for perhaps 100 yards downstream towards Billingsgate. It was a stretch of grey shingle where the river had, over centuries, laid down a shelf of small stones mixed with mud, and the tide, going out, left a scatter of the lightest things across it. She walked it with a stoop that was not quite a limp. Her right hip had gone in a fall on ice in the winter of 1849, and it had never set properly, and she had walked with a list to the right ever since. The stick with the iron hook, which the children thought of as a tool for turning stones, she used almost as a third leg. She leaned on it as she bent. She braced with it as she straightened. The cold, at her age, was the worst of it. A boy of 9 could stand in 2 feet of water for an hour and feel nothing but the numbness in his toes, and his blood would come back into them within a quarter of an hour of climbing out. A woman of 60 could not. The cold went into her hip and stayed there, and it went into the knuckles of her right hand, where they had begun to swell into the shape that a doctor of that century would have called rheumatism, and left at that. She wore, for that reason, 2 pairs of stockings pulled up over her calves, wool over cotton, and above them a skirt of coarse serge that she had made herself out of a blanket, and above that a shawl that had been her mother's. She was still cold. She would still be cold when she got home. She would sit for an hour by whatever fire she could raise in her single room in Nightingale Lane before the pain in her hip settled enough to let her sleep. You have to remember what a single room in Nightingale Lane meant in that year. Nightingale Lane ran north from Wapping High Street, up towards the church, and the houses along it had been built for merchants in the 1700s and had been broken up into lodgings 60 years before. Mrs. Fowler's room was on the 4th floor, at the back, and it looked out onto a yard that had a privy in one corner shared by 9 families. The rent was 1 shilling a week, paid in coppers on a Monday morning, to a man who came round in a stovepipe hat and wrote it down in a book. If she was short, he did not send her away at once. He gave her until the Wednesday. If she was still short on the Wednesday, her things went into the yard and the door was locked, and she would sit on her bundle in the rain until a neighbour took her in for the night. This had happened to her twice. She talked about it, when she talked at all, as one might talk about a bad winter. Come back with me to the shore, because she has stopped and bent down. She has seen something in the rack line that has caught the grey light. It is small. She turns it over with the point of her stick, and then, with a little grunt for her hip, she goes down onto one knee in the wet and picks it up between her fingers. It is a coin, not a modern one. It is Elizabethan, 3 centuries old, silver, the size of a fingernail. A groat or a 3pence, worn on both faces but with the Queen's outline still readable if you turned it against the light. She weighed it in her palm for the space of a breath. Then she put it into a small cloth bag that hung inside her bodice, quite separate from the basket on her hip, and she said nothing at all to anyone about what she had found. There were 2 reasons for that silence. The first was that a silver coin, even one worn nearly flat, would fetch more from a dealer in the Minories than from the rag-and-bone man on Rosemary Lane, and the dealer in the Minories would not open his door until 9, and until then the coin was best kept out of sight. The second was that the other mudlarks, if they knew, might work her stretch after she had gone up, and might find another, and Mrs. Fowler had made her rent for 4 winters running on the coins the rack line gave her, and she did not intend to share the knowledge of which stones they collected against with anyone else. The record does not say what she thought as she stood up. It is hard to imagine she did not feel some small lift of it, because a silver coin in the palm on a morning when your hip is bad and the fog is in your lungs is a thing that would lift anyone. But whether she thanked God, or whether she thanked the river, or whether she only tucked it away and moved on down the shore because there was still an hour of the tide to work, is not written down. We can guess. We should not pretend to know. I stood on Nightingale Lane once, some years ago now, with a printed copy of the 1851 census in my hand, trying to work out which of the doorways had been hers. The lane is not called Nightingale Lane anymore. Part of it was renamed, and part of it was pulled down, and what stands there now is offices and a small garden and the back of a hotel. It is very ordinary. I could not tell you which door was Mrs. Fowler's. I only know that she climbed some set of stairs on a morning in 1852, with the wet still on the hem of her skirt, and with an Elizabethan groat in a bag against her chest, and that she was tired in a way that a woman of her age has a right to be. The old women of the Foreshore knew things the children did not. They knew which stretches held pins and which held nails, and where the pewter tended to wash up, and where a broken necklace had a habit of coming apart across a single line of stones. They knew the tides not by the timetables the Watermen kept, but by an older sense of it that lived in their bones. They knew the moon. They knew which nights, after a spring tide, the rack line would be at its richest, and which nights, after a neap, it was not worth the walk. A boy of 9 could learn coal and could learn nails, but a woman of 60 knew the river the way a shepherd knows a hill, and it took her the whole of a life to know it. They also knew each other, though they did not speak much on the shore itself. A nod at the top of the stairs when they arrived, a nod at the top of the stairs when they left. Sometimes a word in the yard behind the rag shop, where the women weighed out their finds separately from the children, at a different set of scales, and were given, on the whole, a slightly fairer price, because the rag and bone men had known most of them for 20 years, and would not cheat them in the small ways they might cheat a child. If one of them did not come down for a morning or two, the others noticed. If one of them did not come down for a week, one of the others would go, on the way home, to knock on her door and see whether she needed a fire lit or a doctor called, and the doctor, if he was called, was usually called too late. They did not, as a rule, speak to the children. That was not unkindness. It was a matter of pitches, and of not wanting a boy of 6 to follow you along the rack line and learn where the coins came in. But once in a while, on a morning when a very small child had wandered into the wrong stretch of mud and had begun to cry because the cold had gone into her ankles and would not come out again, one of the old women would walk over and take her by the hand and lead her back to the shelf where the children worked, and would sit her on a dry stone for the space of a minute to rub warmth back into her feet, and would give her a piece of bread from her own pocket. This was not often. It happened enough for the missionaries to have written it down. I want to say one more thing about Mrs. Fowler before we let her go. I do not know what became of her. The burial entry from 1863 may be her, and it may be another woman of the same name. If it is her, she was 64 when she died, and she died of what the parish surgeon wrote down as bronchitis, and she was buried in a common grave at St. Anne Limehouse. If it is not her, then she lived longer than that, and worked the shore until she could not, and the record simply lost her, as it lost so many of them. Either way, she was on the foreshore that morning in 1852, and the groat was in the cloth bag against her chest, and the river had given her the day's rent and something over. She was one of 40 or 50, on the north bank alone, that morning, and every morning of the year. Think of that, as the tide comes back. Think of 40 widows, spread along 4 miles of shore between the tower and Limehouse, all of them bent to the water, all of them working through the pain in their hips and their hands, all of them keeping their pitches and their silences, all of them going up the stairs at 7, with something in a basket that would keep a room warm for the night. Think of the sons in the north who sent shillings when they could. Think of the husbands drowned in the year 1834 and in every year since. Think of the daughters who had married out and could not send more. Think of the rooms on the 4th floors of the lanes that ran up from the water, and of the small fires that would be lit in them by mid-morning, with the coal a child had brought home and the pennies a widow had earned. The tide is nearly at the bottom now, In another hour it will begin to come back. The old women will climb the stairs one by one, with their baskets on their hips and their sticks in their right hands, and they will walk up towards the rag shops on Rosemary Lane in the greying light. Mrs. Fowler will keep the groat where it is, and will go on past the rag shop, and will turn up towards the Minories, where the dealer in the coins will open his door at 9, and will weigh what she has brought, and will pay her 4 shillings for it, and she will walk home with the 4 shillings folded into the same cloth bag, and she will sleep the sleep of the earned that afternoon before the pain in her hip wakes her at dusk. And what she has brought up, and what the children have brought up, and what all of them together are carrying now up the stairs of Wapping and Bermondsey and Blackfriars, all of it is about to be counted, weighed, sorted and sold. That is the trade of the Foreshore. That is where a copper nail becomes a farthing, and a farthing becomes a piece of bread, and a piece of bread becomes another morning in the mud. It is worth understanding how that count was done, and by whom, because the men behind those scales were the second economy of the river, and they held the mudlarks in their hands as surely as the tide did. The price of a nail. Come with me up the alley now, away from the water, because the count is where the day was made or lost, and it is worth seeing how it was done. The rag shop on Rosemary Lane stood between a chandler and a house that had been let out into 6 lodgings. Its front was painted a dark green that had been fresh in the year the Queen came to the throne, and had not been touched since. Above the door hung a board on which the word rags had been written in white lead, and beneath it, in a hand that a different painter had added later, the words bones, metal, coal. The window was hung with sacking on the inside so that you could not see in from the street. The door stood open from 6 in the morning until 8 at night, and behind it, at a set of iron scales bolted to a table, sat a man called Mr. Pike. I say a man called Mr. Pike. That is what the children called him. What his name actually was, we do not know for certain. The trade directories for Rosemary Lane in the year 1850 list 4 rag and bone dealers between the corner of Cable Street and the church, and a Josiah Pike among them, and it may be him, or it may be one of the others, and the children of the Foreshore were not particular about the spelling of the men who paid them. He was perhaps 50. He wore a leather apron that had been black for as long as anyone alive remembered. His right thumb was flattened at the end from 30 years of pressing the pan of the scales down, and he was said, by the missionaries who kept records of the street, to be a fair dealer as such men went, which was not the same thing as saying that he was a fair dealer. The girl of 11 came in first, with the boy of 6 at her heels. She lifted her pail onto the table and tipped the coal out onto a sheet of iron that lay there for the purpose. The boy emptied his pockets. The length of tarred rope she uncoiled from her shoulder and laid to one side. The 2 small bones and the length of iron she set down last, because those were the worst of the lot, and she wanted them counted at the end. Mr. Pike weighed the coal first. £11 and a fraction, by his own reckoning, and the price he gave was a penny and a farthing for the lot. Coal at the wharf gate in 1850 was going at about 16 shillings a ton for the best Newcastle, and by the time a merchant delivered it in half-hundredweight sacks to a household, it was closer to £1 a ton, and £11 off the Foreshore in the hand of a child fetched, as I say, a penny and a farthing. The child could not have done that sum. She knew only that when she brought in an ordinary pail she got a penny, and when she brought in a heaped pail she got a penny and something over, and this morning it was something over. Then the copper spikes. He tipped them into the pan, weighed them without a word, and named 9pence for the 12. Copper on Cable Street was fetching between 8pence and 1 shilling a pound for scrap, and what the girl had brought was near enough a pound, and 9pence was not the top of that price and not the bottom of it. Mr. Pike wrote nothing down. The pan came off the scales. The spikes went into a wooden box behind him marked with a chalk letter C. He said the word 9pence once, without looking up, and moved on. The rope was 13 feet, and he did not weigh it. He looked at it, ran a hand along its length to feel where the tar was still whole, and named 2pence. He would sell it on the same afternoon to a chandler 2 doors down for 4pence, and the chandler would cut it and retar the frayed end, and sell it to a lighterman for 6pence, and the lighterman would use it to hitch a coal barge against a Thames wall for the next 4 years, and all of that trade began with a girl of 11 walking barefoot into 2 feet of the coldest water in London at 5:30 in the morning. The bones he weighed for the sake of form, though he had no need to. Bones went by the bushel, not the pound, and 2 small ones were not worth the weight. He put them into the pan and named a farthing for the pair, and pushed the pan back across the table without ceremony. The length of iron he refused. It was too rusted, he said, to sell on. She could take it with her, or leave it in the corner for the boy who came round for the parish scrap. She left it in the corner. She did not argue. Nobody argued with Mr. Pike about a piece of iron. He counted her total on his fingers. 1 penny and 1 farthing for the coal, 9pence for the copper, 2pence for the rope, 1 farthing for the bones. He counted it twice, because he counted everything twice. And then he opened a drawer under the table and laid the coins out, one by one, in a small line on the wood. A silver threepenny piece, a copper penny, a halfpenny, 3 farthings. She swept them off the wood into the palm of her hand and knotted them into the corner of a rag she carried in the pocket of her skirt, and she said, "Thank you, sir," in a voice so quiet it barely carried across the counter. The boy of 6 said nothing. He never said anything to Mr. Pike. He was afraid of him, though Mr. Pike had never once raised a hand or a voice to him, and this was not a thing the boy would have been able to explain. That was the sum, 1 shilling and 1 farthing, in the money of 1850, for the 2 of them, for the 4 hours between 5 and 9. It is worth putting that against what it bought. A quartern loaf of the coarsest bread, weighing 4 pounds, was 5pence halfpenny at a baker on Cable Street. A pound of the cheapest bacon was 6pence. A pound of potatoes was 1 farthing. A pint of blue milk, watered down twice from what the milkman had left the dairy with, was 1 penny. A candle of tallow, thick as a thumb, was 1 halfpenny, and would give 3 hours of light. Half an ounce of tea was 2pence, and a small twist of sugar was another penny. A tin bath of hot water at the public wash-house at Wapping was 2pence, and included a scrap of soap. Rent on the room was 2 shillings a week. Coal for the fire, if you had to buy it from the sackman, was 3pence for a 1/2 hundredweight, but if the boy had brought home a pail of Foreshore coal there was no need to buy it that evening. So 1 shilling and 1 farthing was, for 2 people, near enough half the day's needs. It was breakfast tomorrow if there was any left over from the night before, and it was dinner tonight, and it was the tallow for the corner of the room where the mother was sewing shirt seams by piecework for a Whitechapel warehouse. It was not enough. It never was. That is why, when the girl left Mr. Pike's counter and walked out into Rosemary Lane with the coins knotted at her hip, she was already thinking about the afternoon tide. The 2 brothers of 9 and 10 came in next, and it went the same way for them, though their find was heavier, and they came out with 1 shilling and 8pence between them. A boy with a shawl full of rags stood behind them and got a penny. A girl with a bundle of horsehair from a broken chair back got another halfpenny. And so it went, all through the greying morning, at 4 rag shops between Cable Street and the church, and at another 6 shops further west by Blackfriars, and at as many again along the south bank between Bermondsey Stairs and the Elephant. Multiply what I have just described by 300, and by every day of the year that the tide fell before dawn, and you have the trade of the foreshore. The old women were weighed at a different scale. Mr. Pike kept a smaller set behind him, on a shelf, and when Mrs. Fowler came through his door at 8:15, with her basket on her hip and her stick in her right hand, he took the small scale down and set it on the counter in front of her without a word. She did not, of course, put the groat on it. The groat had gone another way, up towards the Minories, and would fetch its 4 shillings from the dealer who kept the little shop opposite the church of St. Botolph. What she put on Mr. Pike's scale was the ordinary morning's work. A brass button, pewter-mounted, 2 clay pipe stems, unbroken, a spoon with the bowl bent flat, a halfpenny worn smooth, 6 copper nails, small, a twist of lead that had come off a roof somewhere upriver, a curtain hook of iron, whole, 2 glass bottle stoppers. He weighed the pewter first, and the copper, and the lead, and he named a total for the metal of 7pence halfpenny. The button he took separately, turning it over to look at the shank, and offered a farthing for it. The bottle stoppers he offered a halfpenny for the pair, because they were the sort that a barber down Cable Street would take for his shelf. The pipe stems he waved away, unless she wanted to try them at the tobacconist, and she did not, because the tobacconist gave a farthing for a dozen, and it was not worth the walk. The halfpenny she kept, because it was still a halfpenny, and it would go into her rent bag as it stood. She counted the total under her breath, in a habit as old as the trade. 7pence halfpenny, a farthing, a halfpenny, 8pence and a farthing. She did not thank him. That was not because she was ungrateful. It was because 30 years of the same counter had made it unnecessary. He nodded. She nodded. She swept the coins into the cloth bag at her chest, on top of the groat, and she went out again into Rosemary Lane and turned north towards the Minories with the light of the morning full on her face. We should sit for a moment with the arithmetic, because it is the whole shape of a life on the foreshore. If a widow like Mrs. Fowler brought in 8pence and a farthing from Mr. Pike on a good morning, and if the coin dealer at the Minories paid her 4 shillings for a groat once every 3 or 4 weeks, and if her son in the north sent her a shilling on any week he could, she was living on something between 2 shillings and 5 shillings a week. Rent was 1 shilling of that. Fire was another. Bread was as much as she could bear. Tea was rare. Bacon was rarer. A new pair of stockings was a thing she saved for from Christmas to Christmas. This is not a life anyone would have chosen. It was a life a widow of Wapping in the year 1850 could hold together, day by day, so long as the tide kept giving her something, and so long as her hip held out, and so long as no one broke into her room while she was out, and stole the little she had. If a child of 11, working for a household of 6, brought in a shilling on a good morning, and less on a poor one, and if the father brought in 10 shillings from the docks on the days they wanted him, and nothing on the days they did not, and if the mother earned 2pence a hundred at the seam sewing, and could do perhaps 300 a day if her eyes held, then the household was living on something close to 15 shillings in a good week, and 8 in a bad one. Rent was 2 shillings of that. Fire was as much of it as the boy could bring home for nothing. Bread was the largest single cost. Bacon was Sunday. Boots, for a father, were kept mended by a cobbler in the yard who worked for coppers. Boots for a child were not worn at all, until the child was old enough for the docks or the workhouse or the sea, and then the first pair was given at that point and was made to last. The nail in the title I gave this chapter is not one nail. It is any nail. It is a copper spike drawn out of Thames mud at 5:30 in the morning by a boy who has stood 2 feet deep in the water and cannot feel his feet. It is a lump of coal picked out of the shingle at Custom House. It is a length of tarred rope that will hitch a lighter to a Thames wall for 4 years. It is a pewter spoon, flattened by the tide and by whatever weight has passed over it in the meantime. It is a groat of Queen Elizabeth's coinage, worn nearly flat, silver still. It is the whole quiet count of things that moved from the river into the yard of a rag shop, and from the yard of the rag shop into a stove, or a workshop, or a barge, or a coin dealer's tray, and from there back into the mouths of the widows and the children who had gone into the mud for them at first light. I want you to hear something that will not survive on the page. The rag shops were not silent. They rattled. They rattled with the sound of copper nails going into a wooden box, and pewter buttons going into a tin, and coal falling from a pail onto a sheet of iron, and small coins being counted onto a wooden counter and swept off again into a rag. The whole lane rattled, from 6 in the morning until 8 at night. It was the sound of a city turning what its river had thrown up back into money, and it went on, morning after morning, for the whole length of the century, and the Mudlarks were the first hands in that chain, and Mr. Pike and his kind were the second. By 9 o'clock the rag shop on Rosemary Lane was full, and the yard behind it was fuller, and the children who had done their count were sitting on the wall of the yard with their bread and their coins, and the old women who had done theirs were going home one by one, with their baskets lighter than they had been when they came up the stairs. The sun, if there was any sun that morning, was still not through the fog. The river beyond the houses was rising again. The tide would be back at the wharves by noon, and the barges would be moving in earnest, and the foreshore would be under water and out of reach until the small hours of the following morning. But the shore does not empty when the children leave it. There is a moment, in the hour after the count, when the mud between the stairs is entirely uninhabited, and the gulls come down onto it, and nothing is picked up, and nothing is carried off. And then, As the water rises and the light strengthens, another kind of worker comes down to the river altogether. Not for coal, and not for nails, and not for coins, for something heavier and colder, and paid for by the parish, at a shilling a body, and this trade too was part of what the Thames gave and what it took, and it is worth going down to the water once more to see it done. The stench and the sickness. Before we go down for the men who worked the tide for bodies, we have to sit for a chapter with the sickness that was in the water itself, because it is what took most of the mudlarks in the end, and not the drowning. Come back with me to the shore. It is a hotter day now, and the year is 1858. The summer that year did something to the river that even the oldest of the watermen could not remember. By the middle of June, the Thames had turned a colour that was not quite green and not quite brown, and along the wharves at Wapping and Bermondsey, the surface carried a skin on it that broke as a barge went through and closed again behind the wake. What was in that skin was, in plain speech, sewage. Every house drain, every yard privy, every slaughter yard, every tannery outfall from the head of the fleet down to Deptford Creek emptied, in one way or another, into the Thames, and had done so for the whole of the century. What made the summer of 1858 worse than every other summer was the heat. The temperature at the new Palace of Westminster stood at 96 degrees Fahrenheit in the last week of June, and the tide was low, and there had been no rain worth the name for 11 weeks. They called it the Great Stink. The name came from the newspapers, and it was in the newspapers because it had reached, at last, the men in Parliament, who could no longer sit in the committee rooms along the river without their handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, and lime chloride steeped in the curtains to keep the air from turning them ill. A bill for the building of a new set of sewers was carried through the House of Commons in 18 days that summer, which was faster than any bill of that scale had ever moved in that century, and it was carried because the members of the House had, at last, smelled the same river the mudlarks had been standing in since they were 6. But the mudlarks had smelled it for longer than the year 1858. What was new to Westminster in that summer had been ordinary to the Foreshore for a lifetime. A boy who worked between Wapping Old Stairs and the entrance to the London dock in 1850 could have told you which stretch of the shore was worst on which tide, and would have told you without any particular emphasis, as a boy in a farming village might have told you which field flooded first in a wet October. There was a drain that came out into the river beside the sugar house at the head of Nightingale Lane, and the boys knew it and worked around it. Another sat beneath the piers of Southwark Bridge, and the smell of that one in July would knock the breath out of a grown man for the space of a heartbeat. Further west, the great outfall of the fleet came out under Blackfriars, and every mudlark in that reach of the tide gave it a wide berth, because whatever was in that flow was not fit to be near for any length of time. I want to be honest about what this meant for a child. It meant that a girl of 11 who stood in the water at 5:30, on a morning after the tide had run against a slack current all night, was standing in something that a reader of this century would have refused to touch with a gloved hand. She washed her feet when she got home in a bowl of the same river water carried in from the yard butt, and the yard butt had itself been filled from a standpipe that drew, in most parts of Wapping in the 1850s, from the East London Waterworks Company, and the East London Waterworks Company drew its water from the Lee, which was a river of similar habits to the Thames. A pump on Rosemary Lane gave water that was piped from the New River, which was cleaner, and the households that could afford to pay a boy a farthing to fetch water from that pump did so. Mrs. Fowler's household on Nightingale Lane could not afford the farthing, and drew from the yard butt like the rest of the 4th floor. What she boiled for tea, and what her neighbours boiled for their children, came out of the same river that the children had been standing in at dawn. You understand, I hope, where this is going. The mudlarks drank the river that the city had emptied itself into, and it took them in the ordinary course of things, and it took them in waves in the years of the cholera. The first great cholera visitation had come in the year 1832, before most of the mudlarks I have been describing were born. The second came in 1849. The third, which was the one the men who wrote about it remembered longest, came in 1854. A fourth would come in 1866, and it would be the last of them at that scale, because by then the new sewers were in, and the water companies had, most of them, moved their intakes upriver above the tidal reach. In the years between 1832 and 1866, the cholera killed something like 40,000 people in London. Nobody kept a separate count of the mudlarks among them. There would have been hundreds of them, easily. The parish burial books tell the shape of it, without giving names, in a way that would help us. Come with me to a room in a court off Wapping High Street in the second week of September in the year 1849, because the sickness came in that week and did not leave for a month. What I am about to describe is not a single child. It is a shape that recurs, in one court after another, through the reports of the Board of Health for that autumn. A girl of 10, the daughter of a labourer at the London dock, working the Foreshore since she was 7. She came home on the morning of the 15th, with a griping in her stomach. By the evening she could not keep water down. By the small hours of the 16th her mother could not raise her from the bed. She died at 4 in the afternoon of the 16th. She was buried at St. Anne Limehouse the following day, in a common grave with 4 others. The parish paid 7 shillings and 6pence for the burial. There was no stone. The records do not, as a rule, give her name. The clerks were writing in a hurry, and the child was one of many, and by the second week of the outbreak, the surgeons were signing certificates in blocks of 10. What is not written anywhere is what her mother said to her in the last hours. It is hard to imagine there were no words, but whether her mother sat with her, or whether she had to leave the room to fetch water from the yard, or whether she was already sick herself and could not sit up, is not known to us and cannot be known. The cholera did not look the way we sometimes imagine it. It was not a slow decline. It was a matter of hours, sometimes less. A child could be at the shore in the morning and dead by the evening of the same day, and the terrible thing about it, for the mothers and the fathers of the courts of Wapping, was how fast the body went. The disease drew the water out of the flesh so quickly that a face that had been round on the Sunday would be sunken by the Monday afternoon, and the skin would take on a colour that the physicians of the time called bluish, and which was the colour of the blood no longer moving as it should. The old women of the Foreshore, who had seen it in 1832, knew the look before any surgeon put a name to it. They would tell a neighbour to send for the parish, and the parish sent a nurse if there was one to spare, and the nurse, if she came, could do very little. I want to say a word about what the physicians thought at that time, because it matters for the shape of the story. The germ was not yet part of the story of disease as it was understood in the courts of Wapping in 1849. Most of the medical men then believed that the cholera came from bad air. A miasma, they called it. They thought it rose out of decomposing matter and hung over districts where the drains were open and the graveyards full. They were not entirely wrong to notice that it went where the air was worst, but they were wrong about why, and it took the work of a Dr. John Snow, whose map of a pump in Broad Street in the year 1854 became one of the founding documents of that new science, to show that the sickness travelled by water. What is important to remember is that in 1849, when the child died in the court off Wapping High Street, nobody in the room could have told her mother not to drink from the yard butt. They did not know it yet. The Mudlarks knew something, though they could not have said it in those words. They knew that certain stretches of the shore made you ill, and they knew the yard butts on certain lanes were worse than others, and they knew that a household that could afford a farthing for New River water on Sundays fared better than a household that could not. It was a knowledge without a theory behind it. It was the knowledge that the poor of every century have carried about the streets they live in, a map of which corner is dangerous, held in the bones, and not written anywhere. The undertakers on Cable Street did a heavy trade in the September of 49. The parish paid 7 shillings and 6pence for a pauper burial, which included a plain deal coffin and the ground at St. Anne Limehouse, and did not include a stone. In the worst week of the outbreak, the undertakers had them stacked in the backyards behind the shops, because the ground could not be dug fast enough. The children who died went into common graves in 5s and 6s. The clerks got their ages a little wrong, because they were writing in a hurry, and because the mothers themselves were sometimes not entirely sure of the year. It is the sort of error that ran through the whole record of that summer, and it means that when we count the dead now, we are counting through a fog of clerks, writing at speed, and getting the small facts a shade off. Let me tell you what I did not know until I stood in the churchyard at St. Anne Limehouse, some years ago now, on a wet afternoon in November. The common graves are not marked. There is no line of stones. There is only a lawn, kept by the church, and the knowledge that under the lawn, in trenches dug in the 1840s and 50s, there are perhaps 8,000 or 9,000 men, women and children of the parish, and that a great many of the mudlarks of that century lie in among them. I could not have picked out where any single one of them lay. I stood at the edge of the grass, and I could not tell you which end held the summer of 49 and which end held the winter of 32. It is very ordinary ground. A pigeon flew down onto it and picked at something and flew off again, and that was all. The great stink of 1858, which is what the newspapers wrote about, killed almost no one in the end. That is the strange thing. The summer of the stink was hot and foul, and the members of Parliament could not sit in their rooms. But the cholera did not come with it, because the weather broke in the 3rd week of July, and the rains came, and the tide flushed the worst of it out to sea. What the summer of 1858 did do was change the shape of the city's answer to the river. The bill that went through the House in those 18 days paid for a Mr. Joseph Bazalgette to build a great intercepting sewer system along both banks of the Thames, and the digging of it began in the following year, and it went on for the best part of a decade, and it changed, in the end, the whole story of the Foreshore. But that later story belongs to another chapter, because the building of the embankment closed the old stairs one by one and drove the mudlarks off the shore in a way that the sickness never quite had. For now, in 1849 and 1850 and 1854 and 1858, the shore was still open, and the tide was still coming in twice a day, and the widows and the children were still going down to it in the hour before dawn, and the sickness was still taking them, in ones and twos in the ordinary weeks, and in tens and hundreds in the bad ones. You have to sit with that for a moment, because the numbers I have been giving you are not really numbers. They are a girl of 10 in a court off Wapping High Street, and a widow of 52 in Nightingale Lane, and a boy of 6 whose name never made it into any book, and another widow in Bermondsey whose burial entry gives no age at all. They are hundreds like them across the tidal reach of the river, in every year of the century in which the mudlarks worked. And they were, in the sight of the parish clerks and the surgeons and the newspaper men who came down to look, ordinary. That was the terrible thing about it. Nobody was surprised. A child dead of the cholera in a court off Wapping High Street was not news, because the child was poor, and the court was poor, and the river was what it was. The tide is coming back now, on the day I have been asking you to imagine. It is later in the morning than the tides we have watched together in the earlier chapters, because the sickness runs on a clock of its own and does not keep to the low water. The foreshore is emptying, the barges are moving. Somewhere on the shingle between Wapping Old Stairs and the entrance to the London dock, a girl who might have been the girl in the record, and might have been another altogether, is walking home with a penny knotted at her hip, and she does not yet know that the water she drank at breakfast will kill her by Thursday, and neither does her mother, and neither does the surgeon at the parish infirmary, who will come to sit with her when they send for him. And down on the water, where the shore has cleared, another set of men are pushing off from the stairs in a rowing boat, with grappling hooks in the bottom of it, and a length of rope coiled at the bow, and they are the men who will come down every day of that century, for a different harvest altogether. They worked in the same river the mudlarks worked, and they worked for what the river held that was heavier than a copper nail, and they too were part of the trade of the foreshore. The Dredgermen and the Drowned. The boat that pushed off from Wapping Old Stairs a little after 10 in the morning belonged to a man called Silas Roach, and he had been working the tide for the dead for 29 years by then. Come out with me onto the water for a while. The oars go in the locks with a soft knock of wood on wood. Roach sits at the stern and gives the pace with a hand on the tiller. His son, who was 17 that year, pulls the oars. A third man, a nephew called Ned Curtis, sits in the bow with a grappling hook laid across his knees and a coil of tarred rope at his feet. This was a trade with a name. They were Dredgermen. Some people on the shore called them body finders, and some the older name, which was Thames dredgers, though the men themselves preferred the first word or none at all. What they did was row up and down the tidal reach between London Bridge and the Isle of Dogs, from the middle of the morning to the turn of the afternoon tide. and look for what had come up in the night. I should tell you what I mean when I say what had come up. The Thames, in the middle of the last century, was pulling perhaps 300 or 400 bodies out of itself every year by one count, and closer to 500 by another. The clerks of the river police kept one register, and the coroners of the 4 riverside parishes kept another, and the two did not always agree, because a body found near the boundary of Stepney and Poplar might be entered by either bench, and sometimes by neither. What is certain is that on any given week, in any given season, the river was giving up between 5 and 10 dead into the hands of the men who went looking for them. Some were suicides. Some were drownings from the docks, a lighterman lost between a barge and a wall, a coal porter fallen from a plank. Some were murder. A great many were unknown, and would stay unknown. The parish paid for each one. That was the arithmetic of the trade. A body brought ashore and delivered to the parish beadle at the nearest set of stairs entitled the finder to a fee, which in the middle years of the century stood at 5 shillings for a body found within the parish bounds, and half of that if the finder took it out of the tide but delivered it into a neighbouring jurisdiction. There were coroner's fees on top of that for the witness who spoke at the inquest, and there was, sometimes, a further reward from a family or a lodging-house keeper who had been looking for someone missing. A skilled dredgerman with a good week could take £1 out of the river in fees alone. In a poor week he took nothing at all, and the boat came back empty at 3 o'clock and the men went home hungry. Silas Roach was not, I should say, a hard man. That is what the newspaper writer Henry Mayhew found when he came down to Wapping in the 1850s to write about the trade, and it is what the parish curate at St. John Wapping wrote in his own notebook, and it is what his neighbours on Broad Street said of him when he died in the year 1864, at the age of 61. He was, they said, a decent man. He gave his son a share of every fee. He never took a coin from a corpse without noting it down on the slip he handed to the beadle, so that if a family came to claim what was on the body they would get it back. This was not the practice of every man in the trade. Some kept the shillings and the watches and the wedding rings, and if a family asked they would say the water had taken them, and sometimes it had and sometimes it had not. Roach was not one of those. The record makes that plain. Come closer to what a morning in the boat was like. Ned Curtis, at the bow, would stand every few minutes and shade his eyes and look along the rack line of the ebb, because a body in the Thames did not, as a rule, float in the open channel. It went where the current pushed it, and the current pushed it into the eddies at the pier heads, and into the mouths of the docks and into the reeds at the edge of a low bank. He would call back to his uncle in a voice that did not carry beyond the boat, and Roach at the tiller would put them across at that angle. The nephew would drop the hook, and if the hook caught, the son at the oars would hold the boat steady while the 2 others drew the body up hand over hand along the rope. It was slow work. It was work that would turn a boy's stomach in the first month, and never in any month after that. Bodies that had been in the water for a night and half a day were bad enough. The ones that had been in for a week, in July, were worse than the words on this page can carry, and I will not put them into the words because you are trying to sleep, and because the bodies were people, and the people had names, and the names deserve better from us than the description of what the river had done to their faces. I want to sit for a moment with what we do and do not know about the dead the Dredgermen brought in. The coroner's court records for the parish of Stepney between 1850 and 1860 give a shape of it. About a third of the bodies had names attached to them by the time the inquest was held, either because someone had come forward, or because there was a letter in a pocket, or because a lodging-house keeper had reported someone missing that fitted the description. About half were named as unknown male or unknown female of about such an age, and the last portion were, in the language of the clerks, remains of unknown persons, in a state such that no likeness could be taken and no age given. The unknowns went into pauper graves. They went into St. Anne Limehouse and St. George in the east, into the same common trenches the Mudlarks went into in the cholera years, and they went at the same price, 7 shillings and 6pence for the burial, no stone. What the parish did do, from about the year 1855 onwards, was keep a book at the workhouse, in which a description of every unknown body was written down, with the day it was found and the place, height, approximate age, colour of hair, any marks, any garments, any item found on the person. This was for the sake of the families who might come looking. A woman in Manchester who had not heard from her son in London for 6 months could write to the parish and ask, and the clerk would look through the book and write back, and sometimes there would be a match, and sometimes there would not. Some of those books have survived. They are held now at the London Metropolitan Archives at Farringdon. I have read a page or two of them. The handwriting is very ordinary, and the descriptions are very plain, and the pages, the ones I saw, were not stained with anything more than tea and time. But I have jumped ahead of the tide. At about midday, on the day I have been asking you to imagine, Roach's boat came up alongside the piers of Southwark Bridge, and Curtis saw what he had been half looking for since 8 in the morning, a dark shape in the eddy on the downstream side of the second pier. He did not call out. He gestured. Roach put them across. The hook went down. It took 2 tries. When they had the man up along the side of the boat, they got a rope under the arms, and they towed him, gently, back to the stairs at Old Swan Lane on the north bank, because Old Swan Lane was the nearest set of stairs in the parish of St. Michael Crooked Lane, and St. Michael Crooked Lane paid the same fee as Wapping did. The beadle was not there. He was never there. A boy of 14 was sent to fetch him from the alehouse 2 streets up, and he came down at his own pace, wiping his mouth on the back of his hand. He looked at the man on the bottom of the stairs, and he wrote 3 lines in his book, and he signed a chit for the fee, and he sent Curtis with the chit up to the workhouse clerk, who paid it out in coin at the door. A woman had come down from the alehouse behind the beadle, and stood on the top of the stairs with her arms folded, and looked at the man on the bottom of the stairs for a long moment, and she said, "That is not him. Thanks be to God, that is not him," and she went back up. The dead man was, in the end, named. 2 days later, a lodging-house keeper from the borough came to the workhouse and identified him as a lodger who had gone out on the Monday evening and had not returned. His name was John Ellery. He was 34. He had been a clerk at a chandler's in Bermondsey, and he had, said the lodging-house keeper, been low in his spirits for some weeks, and had spoken once, in the kitchen, of Waterloo Bridge, though the keeper had not thought anything of it at the time. He had, the coroner concluded, taken his own life by drowning while of unsound mind. The verdict was of unsound mind because the church, at that time, would not bury a man in consecrated ground if the verdict was otherwise, and the coroners of the riverside parishes had a habit of finding for the family, when there was a family, because it was the kinder thing to do. Ellery was buried at St. John Horsley Down, at the expense of his employer. There is a burial entry in the parish register. There is no headstone. I have stood on Old Swan Lane. It is not there. Or rather, it is there, in name, on a short dead end that runs off Upper Thames Street, between 2 office blocks, and the stairs to the water are long gone, buried under the embankment. I could not have shown you where the beadle stood and where Ellery lay. There is a car park in more or less the right place. It is very ordinary ground. That would be one body of perhaps 6 or 7 the boat brought in over the whole of the year 1850. If it was a fair year, it would put 10 shillings in Roach's pocket, or 15 if the family paid the reward that the lodging-house keeper offered. It was not a life anyone would have chosen for a living. Roach's son took over the boat when Roach died in 1864 and worked it for another 11 years, and the nephew Ned Curtis stayed in the trade until 1872, when the river police took over the dredging in most of the Pool of London, and the fee was cut back, and the last of the private dredgermen went ashore for good. We should say what the Mudlarks made of them. The dredgermen and the Mudlarks worked the same shore, and mostly the 2 trades left each other alone. A child on the shingle at Wapping Old Stairs would look up when a dredgerman's boat came past, and the man in the bow would nod at the child, and the child would nod back, and nothing more was said. The old women were more particular. Some of them thought the trade an ungodly one, and would go up the alley away from the water rather than pass a boat with a body in it. Others thought it a mercy. Mrs. Fowler, the widow of Nightingale Lane whose mourning we have watched, would cross herself when a dredgerman's boat went past her stretch of the shore, and say a word for whoever was in it, whether there was anyone in it or not, and she did this every morning of every year that we have any record of her. She had lost her husband to the river in 1838. The trade of finding the dead was not, to her, ungodly. It was the doing of a kindness that the water itself would not do. I said, some pages back, that a great many of the dead the Dredgermen brought up would stay unknown. That is the hardest thing to sit with. The parish books of description, the ones held now at Farringdon, are full of pages that end without a name. A woman of about 30, black hair, no rings, a linen chemise mended at the collar, found in the reach off Cherry Garden Pier on the 14th of April in the year 1853. A man of about 50, sandy hair going to grey, a corduroy jacket, no letters, one boot, found at Blackwall Reach on the 2nd of July in the year 1856. Each entry is one line, or two, or three. Each is a family, somewhere, that never knew, or never came, or came too late. The clerks did not add anything to the entries beyond the plain facts. There is a wisdom in that. There is nothing anyone could add. By 2:30 the tide had turned and the boat was heading back. Roach did not row past the piers of London Bridge on the return, because the current there could be difficult on the flood, and he took the boat instead by the south bank, in the slack. His son had let up on the oars. Curtis in the bow was coiling the wet rope back into its loops. The ledgers of the workhouse at St. Michael Crooked Lane for that day show a payment of 5 shillings for the delivery of the body of one John Ellery to the parish. The entry sits in the second column of the second page of the day's expenses, between an entry for coal and an entry for candles, and there is no mark on the ledger to say what it was. It is only a payment. That is how such things went into the record. Roach's boat came back into Wapping Old Stairs at just after 3. The tide was in. The shore they had all worked at dawn was under 6 feet of water. Roach paid his son and his nephew their share on the top step, in shillings and pence, and the 3 of them went up the alley away from the water. The boat was made fast to a ring in the wall of the stairs, and left there. It would be needed again at 8 the next morning, if the tide obliged. Gulls stood along the piers of the bridge. The sun, which had not been through the fog when the Mudlarks were on the shore at dawn, was through now, and lay in a wash of yellow light along the tops of the warehouses on the north bank. But the river was not entirely at peace between the tides. A boat at the head of Wapping New Stairs had not been there at breakfast, and the man on it wore a blue jacket, with a number stitched at the cuff, and he was watching the water and the wharves with a working eye, and he was not a dredgerman. He was one of the men of the Thames police, whose office at Wapping had, for 50 years by then, kept an uneasy watch over everyone else who worked the river. The Mudlarks knew him, and the Dredgermen knew him, and the Watermen knew him, and the peace between them all was a peace that took working at, and it had held, in one form or another, since before any of the children on the shore that morning had been born. The Watermen and the law. His name was Sergeant Elias Meakin, and he had been in the river police for 11 years by the summer we have been living in, and he was watching the flood, because it was his habit to watch the flood, and because the flood was the hour at which most of the trouble began. Come with me over to where he stood, at the head of Wapping New Stairs, so we can see the water through his eyes for a while. The Thames Police kept its office at 259 Wapping High Street, in a plain brick building set back from the shore by the width of the road. It is still there. I have walked past it in this century, on a wet afternoon, and it does not look like much. A blue lamp above the door, and a step worn hollow in the middle, by the boots of the sergeants going in and coming out, one shift after another, since the year 1798. That is where the office had been from the beginning. The River Police was the oldest paid police force in the country, by a good 30 years. It was set up by a magistrate called Patrick Colquhoun and a sea captain called John Harriot in the summer of the year 1798, and it was set up because the West India merchants of the Port of London were losing, by their own count, £500,000 a year in cargo stolen off their ships in the Pool: sugar, rum, coffee, indigo, cargo that came up the estuary from the plantations in the Caribbean and sat at anchor in the reach off Blackwall for weeks at a time, waiting for a berth at the dock, and cargo that was lifted, in the meantime, by an entire economy of men who worked the water in every capacity that could reach it. The merchants put up the money. The force took the ships in its charge, and the losses fell within a year to a fraction of what they had been, and the merchants went on paying for it until the Metropolitan Police was raised in the year 1829, and after that the Wapping Force was folded in 1839 into the same command, and it went on working out of the same house. I want to say a word about what a river policeman actually did, because it is not quite what the words might suggest. Meakin and the men under him did not, as a rule, chase mudlarks. That would be to misunderstand the trade. The children on the shingle at dawn were, in the strict language of the law, trespassing on the foreshore of the Corporation of the City of London, and were also, in the strict language of the same law, committing petty larceny every time they picked up a copper nail that had rolled off a barge in the previous night. In the loose practice of the river, they were doing neither of these things. A sergeant of the Wapping Force would step over a boy on the shingle without a word. What he was watching for was the man in the boat. He was watching, in particular, for the lighterman with a hook and a slow eye. Lighters were the flat wooden barges that carried cargo between the ships anchored in the pool and the wharves along the two banks. A lighterman was licensed by the Watermen's Company, which had been chartered by the Crown in the year 1555, and which held a register of every man legally allowed to move cargo or passengers on the tidal Thames. A man served an apprenticeship of 7 years to become a waterman, and a further year, at his own expense, to add the qualification of lighterman, and at the end of it he was a freeman of the company, and he carried a metal token stamped with a number, and he could work the water without any man's leave. This was, in principle. In practice, a good many of the men working the lighters in the 1850s held no such licence, and had never served the apprenticeship, and the company held periodic musters to try to weed them out, and the police looked the other way when the company's clerks came down to Wapping to ask, because a strict enforcement of the licence would have taken half the working lighters off the river inside a week. What the police were watching for was pilferage. A ship at anchor in the reach off Deptford would be discharging its cargo into lighters, and the lighters would be pulling for the wharves, and somewhere along the way, at the bend of the river past Rotherhithe, or in the shadow of the piers of Southwark Bridge, a lighter would slow, and a hand would go into a bale, and a portion of the cargo would find its way over the side into a boat that had come up alongside, and a shilling or two would come back the other way. This was the trade, and it happened on every working day of the year, and Meakin knew every man in his stretch of the water who was known to work it, and every man suspected of working it, and every boat that was known to sit light in the water when it left an anchorage, and lower when it came back. The Mudlarks entered this story only sideways. If a bale had been slit open in the middle of the river, and a handful of coffee beans had scattered across the deck of a lighter and rolled off into the water, they would wash ashore at the low tide, in whatever eddy the current took them, and a child at the shore in the morning would find them and pick them up and take them home. In the strict language of the law, that child was in possession of stolen goods. In the ordinary practice of the parish, that child had found beans on the shore. Meakin would not have troubled her, and he did not. But the watermen troubled her, and this is the part of the story worth sitting with. The men who worked the barges legally, the men with the metal token stamped with a number, hated the Mudlarks. They hated them steadily, the way a shopkeeper might hate someone who comes in every day and takes a small thing and walks out. What the Mudlarks took from the shore was what the watermen thought of as theirs by right: coal that had fallen from a coal barge as it was unloaded, rope that had slipped off a lighter, nails that had rolled off a plank, timber offcuts that had drifted from a shipwright's yard. The waterman had a licence and a token and 7 years of apprenticeship behind him. The child on the shingle had none of these things. And what the tide gave up in the morning would have been, in a more orderly world, gathered by the waterman himself and sold, at his own convenience, to the yards along Bermondsey Wall. The watermen went to the police often about the Mudlarks. The complaint books at the Wapping office, some of which have survived and are held now at the London Metropolitan Archives, are full of entries in a plain hand, the same complaint written out over and over across the years. A boy on the shore at Cherry Garden Pier was seen to lift a length of copper wire that had come off the barge Amelia Rose. A widow, at the head of Wapping Old Stairs, was seen to gather coal from the shingle that had fallen from the barge Sarah Ann. The sergeant was requested to attend. The sergeants, most of the time, did not attend. When they did, they took a note of the child's name, if the child would give one, and they wrote the note down in the book, and they let the child go. She was 6, or 8, or 10. A magistrate at the Thames police court would not commit a child of that age for the theft of a piece of copper wire that had, on the Mudlark's own account, been in the water when she found it. The waterman would go back down the alley and mutter to his neighbours that the law was a joke, and the sergeant would close the book and go and put the kettle on the office fire. We should say, though, that not all of the complaints were let go. A boy of 13 who was taken up in the year 1852 at Bermondsey Wall in possession of a leather satchel containing a set of brass-handled awls belonging to a shipwright's yard was committed to the Thames Police Court and sentenced to 14 days in the House of Correction at Cold Bath Fields, and the entry sits in the court book, and the sentence was carried out. A girl of 11 was taken up at Blackfriars in the same year for the theft of a bolt of unbleached calico that had, in the finding of the magistrate, plainly not been in the water at any point. She was given 7 days. The line between what the tide gave up and what a child had helped herself to from a warehouse yard was a line the magistrates and the sergeants and the beadles all drew every day of the working week, and where the line fell depended on the sergeant and the magistrate and the child and the day. I said in an earlier chapter that Silas Roach, the dredgerman we went out on the water with, was known to the beadle at Old Swan Lane. He was known to Meakin as well, and to every other sergeant at Wapping. The dredgermen and the river police had, if such a thing existed anywhere on the water, a working understanding. A body found by a dredgerman was reported to the police, and the police attended the coroner's inquest, and the paperwork moved between the two offices without any friction to speak of. Meakin had known Roach for 11 years by the summer we have been living in, and he had stood at the head of the stairs a great many mornings and watched the boat come in with a body under a piece of sailcloth in the bottom of it, and he had signed the paper for the fee and gone back up the alley, and Roach had gone up the other alley, and the two men had not been friends, and had not been enemies, and had been, in a plain sense, colleagues. That, in the end, was how the river worked. There were 3 trades along the shore that overlapped and rubbed together, and there was a 4th, which was the police, which stood a little apart from the other 3 and watched them. Between them all they held a working peace. It was not a peace that anyone would have called kind. The watermen despised the Mudlarks. The dredgermen kept to themselves. The police were, in the phrase the Mudlarks used among themselves, always about but never near. But it was a peace, and the shore kept working, and the tide came in and went out, and every day between about 3 in the morning and about 8 in the evening someone was down at the water doing something, and the river carried on being the river, and none of the 4 trades quite got in the way of any of the others for very long at a time. There were exceptions. There was one autumn, in the year 1854, when a lighterman at Rotherhithe was found by a river policeman in the act of throwing a canvas sack of stolen copper wire off the side of his barge into the shallows on a falling tide, on the reckoning that a child of his acquaintance would fetch it out at dawn and take it to the rag shop and split the proceeds. The lighterman was taken up, and the child, who was 10, was named, and was also taken up, and was sent for 6 weeks to a reformatory school at Feltham, on the ground that she had been in league with an adult, and not merely working the shore as an honest mudlark. She came back to Wapping in the following spring older by more than the 6 weeks she had been away, and she did not go back to the shore, and she went into service in the household of a butcher's widow in Ratcliffe, and that was the end of her time in the trade. I do not know what became of her after that. The parish books stop being any use to us once a child leaves the neighbourhood, and she left it. The record does not tell us, either, whether she blamed the lighterman for what she had gone through, or whether she thought it was the sergeant who had brought her before the magistrate. It does not tell us whether her mother, widowed and with 4 other children on Nightingale Lane, felt the loss of her wage from the shore, or the gain of her wage from service. Some of the mothers in that part of Wapping thought a place in service the making of a girl, and some thought it a slow death, and I have not been able to work out from anything I have read which sort of mother she had. Meakin retired from the force in the year 1861 at the age of 54, with a pension paid quarterly at the Wapping office, and he moved with his wife to a cottage in Poplar, and he lived another 19 years. He had, by his own reckoning at the retirement dinner given him by his brother sergeants at a public house on the corner of Green Bank, taken part in the recovery of some 400 bodies from the river across the whole of his service, and had committed some 1,500 men and boys to the Thames Police Court on charges of pilferage and various river offences, and had let go, on his own count, perhaps 4 times that number of children on the shore. He said at the dinner that he had never met a mudlark he thought a thief, and had never met a lighterman he thought entirely honest. And the room laughed, and it went into the account of the evening that a younger sergeant wrote up for the office newspaper, which was printed once a year, and which survives, in a bound volume, in the archives. The piece held. It held all through the 1850s and into the 60s, and it held even after the great works of the embankment began to eat at the shore, and it held in the ordinary weeks and in the bad ones, and it held through the cholera and through the stink, and the 4 trades of the river went on being 4 trades, and the sergeants and the watermen and the dredgermen and the mudlarks all worked the same water at slightly different hours of the same day, and the water did not care about any of them. But the winter of the year 1860 was coming, and it would be a hard one. The Thames had frozen a little at the edges in most winters that anyone could remember, and a boy or a widow with the sense not to walk out on it had always been able to work the shingle in the middle of the day when the sun had thawed the upper shore. In 1860 the freeze would come earlier and go deeper and stay longer than any winter since the frost fair of 1814, and the shore would not thaw for weeks together, and the mudlarks who worked it would work it because they had to, and it would go into the parish books as the coldest they had known. The long winter. Come back with me to the shore, but move the year on to the end of the 1850s, and then a little further. The winter I want you to sit inside is the winter of 1860, and it began in the middle of December, and it did not let go of the river until the middle of March. That is a long time to be cold. In Wapping and in Rotherhithe, and along the reach at Bermondsey Wall, the mudlarks worked it out because they had no other way to eat, and what they made of it is what this hour is about. The freeze did not arrive all at once. It came on in the 2nd week of December, in the form of a hard frost that held through 3 nights together, and then a 4th, and then a 5th. The shipwrights at Ratcliffe went out to their yards in the morning, and found the pitch in their pots gone to iron. The horse troughs on Wapping High Street were crusted an inch thick by breakfast. The tide came in over ice that had formed on the shingle at low water, and it broke the ice into flat white plates that knocked against the piers of the bridges as the flood carried them upriver. By the 3rd week of December, the plates were joining together into floes, and by the last week of the month, the floes were a mile long, and the boats on the pool were held between them, like objects set in a fixed thing. Come down with me now to Nightingale Lane, at 4 in the morning of the 6th of January, in the year 1861, because that is a morning we have some record of. Mrs. Fowler, the widow of the shore we watched at dawn in an earlier hour, was 73 years old that winter, and she had been working the rack line for more than 50 years by then. On the 6th of January she came down the alley at her usual hour, her shawl over her head and a piece of sacking around her feet inside her boots, and she stood at the head of Wapping Old Stairs, and she looked at what the river had become. The Thames at low water that morning was a field of ice from the north bank almost to the middle channel, and a channel of black water down the centre, no wider than the length of 2 long boats. The floes had grounded on the falling tide and had frozen together into a rough plain, and where a boy had been able to walk out on the shingle in a normal December, there was, that morning, ice as thick as a hand's breadth over the mud. The rack line was buried under it, and nothing that the last tide had left could be picked up without a hammer and an hour of work. She went down the stairs anyway. There was nothing else to do. She had eaten a slice of bread and a cup of tea before she left the house on Nightingale Lane, and she had 4 grandchildren in the house behind her, and she was the earner of the household because her son had gone the year before to a berth on a coaster and had not been heard from. This is what the parish book gives us. It does not tell us what she was thinking as she went down the steps. It does not tell us whether she prayed on the top step, as she did most mornings by the account of her neighbour. or whether the cold had put the prayer out of her. The trade that winter changed. What the tide gave up on a normal day of the year was nails and coal and bones and rag. What the tide gave up in the freeze was buried under ice, and the only way to get at any of it was to work the upper shore where the ice was thinnest, and to break it in slabs with a piece of iron, and to lift the slabs and see what was underneath. It took an hour to get a boy the same handful of coal he would have picked up in 10 minutes in November, and the shore was more crowded than in an ordinary winter, because the freeze had put a good many of the men in the docks out of work, and their wives and their older children had come down to try the mud, and there were, along the reach at Wapping on any morning that January, 2 or 3 times the mudlarks there had been in the autumn. I want to say what happens to a body in weather of this kind, because it matters to what the winter did. A child of 7 working the ice in bare feet, which many of them still did, would lose the feeling in the feet within a quarter of an hour, and would lose the feeling in the hands within an hour, and would work on because the feeling was not the point, the coal was. The parish surgeon at St. John Wapping wrote in his notebook that winter that he had seen more cases of frostbite in the toes and the fingers of children in the month of January than he had seen in the whole of the previous 10 years put together. In a dozen cases, he had had to take off a toe, and in 2 cases, the whole of a foot. He wrote that the children took the surgery in silence, and that this silence troubled him more than the injury did, because it was the silence of a child who had been in pain for so long that a surgeon was, if anything, an improvement. He named none of them. That was the practice of the parish surgery. The book gives us numbers, and it gives us the parts of the body that were taken, and it does not give us any names. There are 24 entries between the 4th of January and the end of March in the year 1861, and we do not know who any of the 24 children were. Some of them are almost certainly in the burial register at St. John Wapping under other entries, because a child with an amputated foot in a house on Nightingale Lane in January of that year had a fair chance of not seeing April. Some of them lived and grew up, and one of them may have been the woman who was noted in the census of the year 1901 as living in a lodging house at Shadwell with a wooden clog on the left foot in place of what should have been there. The census does not say when she lost it or how, and I am guessing at a connection that may not exist. Mrs. Fowler did not lose any part of herself that winter. She was old enough and thin enough and cautious enough of the cold that she went down the stairs each morning wrapped in every piece of cloth she owned. She worked no more than an hour at a time before going back up the alley to sit for a quarter of an hour by the little fire in her kitchen and then to come down again. This was the strategy of the old. The children could not adopt it because they had no fire waiting for them at the top of the alley, and the walk up and back would take them out of the tide window altogether, and they were paid by the pound of coal and not by the hour of work. So they stayed on the ice and they did not go up, and the frostbite went where it went. Come up the alley now, because it is worth seeing what the winter did to the shops that bought from the Mudlarks. The rag shop on Rosemary Lane, which we sat inside a few hours ago, was open every day of the freeze. The man behind the counter was buying at a lower price, because the coal he bought was wet with river water that had frozen and thawed and frozen again inside the sacks, and the nails were rusted from the same water, and the bones were mostly frozen to lumps that would not part cleanly on the hook of the scale. He paid a farthing where he had paid a halfpenny, and a halfpenny where he had paid a penny, and the Mudlarks took what he gave because there was nowhere else to take it. The other rag shops in the neighbourhood were doing the same. The parish knew it. The parish did nothing about it, because the parish had no lever to move a private shopkeeper, and because the parish was itself occupied with keeping the workhouse warm on a fuel bill that had trebled since November. That fuel bill for the winter survives. It is in the account book of the St. John Wapping Vestry, and it shows the parish paying, for the month of January in the year 1861, a sum of £57 and 11 shillings for coal, against a sum for the same month in the previous year of £18 and 4 shillings. That is what the freeze cost the parish for warmth. The vestry made up the difference by cutting the allowance to the outdoor poor, which was the Mudlarks and the widows and the old men on Nightingale Lane and its neighbours. The allowance that had been 18 pence a week to a widow with children in December was cut to a shilling in January and to 9 pence in February. This is not in the account book. It is in the minute book of the vestry meeting for the 3rd of February, and the reason given is that the coal bill must be met, and the outdoor allowance was the only line on the sheet that a vestry could reach in a hurry. I have read that minute. It is written in a plain hand by the clerk, in an ink that has turned the colour of weak tea. The vestryman who moved the reduction, a chandler called Mr. Gorry, is named in the margin, and the vote was carried without opposition, and the meeting went on to the next item, which was the repair of a drain on Wapping High Street. There is no note of anyone having spoken up for the widows. The winter did not, in the end, take Mrs. Fowler. It took a neighbour of hers, a woman called Sarah Beckwith, who was 68, and who was found on the 17th of February in the room she rented on Nightingale Lane, having gone to bed the evening before and having not woken. The parish surgeon gave the cause as the failure of a heart already weakened by the cold. It took a boy of 9 called Thomas Wren, who was in the household of a lighterman on Broad Street, and who had worked the shore through the whole of January and had come home on the 2nd of February with a fever and was buried on the 9th. It took another 8 or 9 children whose names sit in the burial register of St. John Wapping between January and March. It took a great many more in the parishes upriver at Bermondsey and downriver at Poplar, and the total for the whole reach of the river was, by the reckoning of a paper printed in the following spring, something in the neighbourhood of 200 souls, though the paper allowed that this was a rough figure. We should sit for a moment with what the freeze did not do. It did not bring back the frost fair. The last of those had been held in the winter of 1814, when the ice on the Thames had been thick enough between London Bridge and Blackfriars to walk across, and the watermen had set up booths on it, and there had been the roasting of an ox in the middle of the frozen river, and it had gone into every account of the century since as the thing to remember about English winters. In the winter of 1861, the ice was not thick enough for any of that. The new London Bridge, which had been opened in the year 1831, had wider arches than the old one, and the wider arches let the tide run through more freely, and the tide did not now hold the ice in place, in the reach above the bridge, as it had done under the old bridge. The freeze made floes, and the floes made a rough field, but the field was never continuous enough to walk on with any confidence, and no one that I can find set up a booth on it. The account of the frost fair went on being an old story, and a story that the Mudlarks in 1861 would have known about from the old people in their own households, but it was not their story, and the freeze of that year did not become a fair, it became a burial ledger. By the middle of March the ice was breaking up. The floes went down the reach on the ebb one afternoon in a long white parade, and by the following morning the shore at Wapping Old Stairs was mud again. The rack line was the rack line, and the children of Nightingale Lane were down on the shingle in the ordinary way. Mrs. Fowler was among them. She had lost 11 pounds of body weight over the winter, by the account of her neighbour, and her hands would never quite come back to what they had been. She would work another 6 years on the shore before she went into the workhouse infirmary in the summer of 1867 and died there in the autumn. But the shore itself was about to change. Something was already at work on the north bank that would, within 20 years, take the foreshore we have been walking on and put stone over it, and the men and the women and the children who had worked it since the first day of the century would find that the river they had known had gone somewhere they could not follow. Come up with me to the top of Wapping Old Stairs in the spring of that year, and look west along the Thames toward the city, and you will see, on the far bank at Somerset House, the first of the wagons and the first of the wooden hoardings of a great work that was about to begin. The slow vanishing. Come with me now to the top of the stairs, and look west along the river, because what I want to show you is a long way off, but you can see it from here on a clear morning. The wagons at Somerset House have been coming down to the shore since before Easter. The wooden hoardings run for a good half-mile, along the north bank between the Temple and Charing Cross, and behind the hoardings there is the sound of hammering that starts at 7 every morning and does not stop until dusk. What is being built there does not yet have a name that the Mudlarks at Wapping would know. In the papers it is called the Thames Embankment. In the office of the Metropolitan Board of Works, at Spring Gardens, it is called by a longer title and a set of numbers, and by the surname of the engineer in charge of it, a man called Basil Gett. We ought to say who he was, because his work is what closes this story. Joseph Bazalgette was born in Enfield to a family of French descent, and he had trained as a civil engineer on the railway lines of the north. In 1956, he had been appointed chief engineer to the new Metropolitan Board of Works, and he had been given the task of putting the sewage of London into pipes and out of the river. The Great Stink of 1958 had persuaded Parliament to give him the money to do it. What Parliament had also given him, and what fewer people spoke of at the time, was the authority to build stone walls along both banks of the tidal Thames from the Tower to Chelsea, and to reclaim behind those walls whatever ground the walls enclosed. This was the embankment, and the embankment was, in plain terms, the end of the foreshore. Come back down the alley with me, and I will show you why. The Mudlarks at Wapping worked shingle. Shingle exists because there is a slope of soft ground between the low tide and the high, and things that fall into the river at the flood settle out on that slope as the tide goes down. A stone wall built at the line of the high tide does two things at once. It removes the slope because it stands where the slope used to stand, and it removes the shingle because there is no longer any soft ground for the tide to leave anything on. The wall meets the water at a vertical face, and the water rises up the face and falls away from it, and nothing settles. What had been a shore becomes a riverbank of the sort a canal has a riverbank, and a bank of that kind is no place for a child with a basket. The work at Somerset House began in the summer of 1964. The method used to hold back the river was old, but the scale was new. A double row of timber piles was driven into the bed of the river, 100 feet out from the existing shore. Between the two rows of piles, the men of the contract packed clay and rubble until they had made a barrier the river could not push through. This was the cofferdam. Once the cofferdam was in place, the water inside it was pumped out, and the ground behind it was excavated to below the low water mark, and the great stone wall of the embankment was built up from that excavated bed to the level of the road above. Behind the wall, the reclaimed ground was filled with the spoil of the excavation, and on top of that ground a road was laid, and gardens were laid out, and gas lamps were put up, and after a few years no one who walked along the new road at Blackfriars would have known that any of it had been under water. The work ran east and west from the middle at once, because the contractors were building it in sections and pushing the river back one section at a time. It reached the site of the old Whitefriars Stairs in 1967. The stairs there had been in use since the 1500s. A waterman had had his stand at their foot since anyone in the parish could remember. There is a plate in a book printed at the middle of the last century that shows the Whitefriars Stairs at low water, with a set of steep wooden steps going down to the shingle, and a boy at the foot of them with a basket in his hand. By 1967, the plate was already a picture of something that had ceased to exist. The stairs had been broken up and taken away by the contractors' men, and the shingle in front of them had been buried under the cofferdam, and the boy in the picture had grown up or had died or had gone to sea, and the shore he had worked was under 20 feet of made ground. The same happened at Essex Stairs, and at Temple Stairs, and at the Adelphi, where the arches beneath the terrace had been used for 100 years by watermen to keep their boats out of the weather. The arches were closed. The stairs were closed. The wharves that had stood along the north bank between the Temple and Charing Cross were bought out by the Board of Works, one by one, with sums that the owners in most cases thought too low, and in some cases thought fair, and the wharves were pulled down, and the coal that had come to them was diverted upstream to the new coal wharves at Pimlico, or downstream to the great docks below the tower. You will hear me say the docks, and I ought to be clearer about that. The docks below the tower had been built across the first half of the century. The London dock had been opened in 1805, and the St. Catherine docks in 28, and the Victoria dock further downstream in 55. Each of them had been dug out of marsh and orchard by an army of men with picks. Each of them was surrounded by a high brick wall, and each of them had its own police force answering to its own private company. The cargo that had been discharged into lighters and taken up the river to the wharves at Blackfriars and the Temple could now be discharged directly onto the quay inside a walled dock. No lighter was needed, no waterman was needed to work the lighter, no shore was needed to catch the coal that fell off the lighter. and no child was needed to pick the coal off the shore. The chain that had run from the ship to the Mudlark broke, one link at a time, over the course of 30 years, and the embankment was the last of the links to break. I want to name a man here, because the record has kept his name, and it seems right to give it. His name was Thomas Halligan, and he had worked the shore at the Temple Stairs from the time he was 8 until the time the stairs were closed. He was 41 when the closure came, and he had a wife and 4 children in 2 rooms on Milford Lane, and he had never done any other work than mudlarking and, for a few years in his 20s, the labouring at a coal wharf that had also, as it happened, been bought out by the board. The paper that gives us his name is a letter he had written to the vestry of St. Clement Danes asking for parish relief on the ground that his trade had been taken away by the works of the board without any compensation to him. The vestry replied that no relief was due to a man who was in health and could seek other work. Halligan was sent away. We do not know what became of him. The parish books of St. Clement Danes have him in them once and then not again. There was a Thomas Halligan buried in the churchyard of St. Mary le Strand in 72, who might have been the same man. And the age is right, but the name is common enough that I cannot be sure. His wife and his children do not appear again either. This is one of the ordinary vanishings of the century. A trade closes, and a family that lived by the trade goes out of the parish, and the parish keeps no record of where they went. Some went into service, some went into the workhouse, some went to the new industrial towns of the north, where a labourer could get a place in a mill, and some of them, one has to accept, went nowhere in particular and simply died in a room in a house whose landlord did not report the death to anyone who would have written it down. At Wapping the change came later, and it came differently. There was no embankment built there until much later in the century, and the shore itself was not walled off from the Mudlarks in the way that the shore at Blackfriars was. What happened at Wapping was that the docks kept getting bigger. The London dock, which had opened at the top of the century, was extended in the 70s. The wharves along Wapping High Street were bought up, one after another, by the dock companies, and were closed to the ordinary trade, and made part of the walled precinct of the dock. The Wapping Old Stairs stayed open, but the shore at the bottom of them grew shorter, because a new river wall had been put in at the foot of the wharves either side of the stairs, and the shingle that had lain along 100 yards of open shore was now confined to a strip perhaps 30 yards long between 2 blank walls of dressed granite. Mrs. Fowler, who we watched at the rack line in the freeze, was still alive when this narrowing began. She was in her 79th year in 72, and by the account of her neighbour on Nightingale Lane, she was down at the stairs most mornings, and she was working the strip that the walls had left her, and she was bringing home what the tide gave up in that strip. What the tide gave up in that strip was less than it had given up in the days when she had had 100 yards of open shore to work. She said this to the neighbour, and the neighbour told it to a clergyman who was collecting accounts of the working poor of Wapping for a pamphlet he printed at his own expense in 74. The clergyman does not give the names of any of the women he spoke to. He describes an old woman at Wapping Old Stairs who had worked the shore for 60 years and who now brought home a quarter of what she had brought home in her prime. It may be Mrs. Fowler, and it may be another woman like her, and there were by that year several such women along that reach. We should be honest that the Mudlarks themselves did not see what was happening as a single thing. From the top of the alley on Nightingale Lane you could not see the works at Somerset House, and even the works at the wharves next door were done in stages, and each stage took a few months, and each stage looked to a woman coming down the alley in the dark like an ordinary bit of building. There was no morning on which the Mudlarks of Wapping woke and were told that their trade had ended. What they were told was that this particular stretch of shore was closed for the works of Mr. Such and would open again in the spring, and when the spring came the stretch was walled and the shingle was gone. And then the next stretch was closed, and then the one beyond that. It was a slow vanishing, and it happened in pieces, and the pieces added up over a decade to the end of a trade. I want to speak of the men and the women who worked the shore alongside the Mudlarks, because their vanishing was of a piece with the Mudlarks' own. The Dredgermen we went out with in the boat of Silas Roach were fewer by the 70s than they had been at the middle of the century, because the river police had taken over more of the recovery of bodies from the water, and the fee that had been paid to the boatman for a body brought ashore had been reduced by the parish and, in some parishes, done away with altogether. Silas Roach himself gave up the trade in 73 at the age of 68, and he moved with his wife to a cottage at Blackheath that his brother had left him, and he died there in 81. The Watermen, who had held the metal tokens stamped with a number and who had served the 7-year apprenticeship, were also fewer, because much of the traffic on the river above the bridge had been taken over by the steam launches of the various pleasure companies that ran between Westminster and Kew. The company kept its register and it kept the apprenticeship, and it does so to this day. But the number of working watermen on the tidal Thames fell from something like 8,000 at the top of the century to something like 1,000 by the end of it, and most of the last of them worked in the docks, on the tugs and the barges, rather than on the open river. Sergeant Meakin, who had watched us all from the head of the new stairs, had been dead for the best part of a decade by the time the wall was built at the foot of the old stairs. He had retired to Poplar and had lived there until 80. His wife had survived him by 3 years. The office at 259 Wapping High Street still stood, and the blue lamp still burned above the door, and a new generation of sergeants was going in and coming out, and none of them had seen the Pool of London when it had been full of the tall masts of the East Indiamen at anchor, and none of them thought of the Mudlarks as a trade because the Mudlarks were, by then, a memory. Come back with me one last time to the head of Wapping Old Stairs. It is the summer of 78 now, and the tide has just turned. There are still 2 or 3 figures on the shingle, and one of them is a boy of about 10 with a piece of sacking tied round his shoulders and a tin can in one hand, and he is working the strip between the 2 blank walls of granite, and he is finding what the tide has left him, and he is putting it in the can, and he is not thinking about the trade or the century or the works. He is thinking about a piece of bread. That is what he was always thinking about. And in the alleys behind him the last of the old Mudlarks are drawing their pensions from the parish, if they have one, or they are in the workhouse infirmary, and their children have gone into service or into the docks, or into other trades that the century now has room for, and it is worth going up the alley with them, into old age, into the closing of a life that had begun on the shore in the first years of the Queen. The tide goes out. Come with me one more time, and this will be the last of it. The tide is on the ebb now in the hour I want to sit inside, and the hour is the very end of the 70s, and we are going up an alley off Wapping High Street to a room at the top of a house on Nightingale Lane. I have been meaning to bring you here for some time. It is where an old woman we have kept company with for 8 hours of this night has been living, and it is where, in a way, the last of this story sits down. Mrs. Fowler was in her 83rd year that autumn. The record for the address at Nightingale Lane is a little patchy in this decade, because the census of 1871 had her under one spelling of her name, and the workhouse book has her under another, and I cannot be sure whether she was living with a grandchild by then, or on her own. Her neighbour on the same floor was a Mrs. Halbrook, a widow of the docks whose husband had been a cooper at St. Catherine's, and Mrs. Halbrook is the one who told the clergyman I spoke of in the last hour what she knew of the old woman's health. What she said was that Mrs. Fowler had gone down to the stairs every low tide of the summer of 78, and had come home each afternoon with a handful of what the shore had left her, and that she had not gone down again after the first frost of October. She had not the strength, was how Mrs. Halbrook put it. There was no more to say than that. We do not know the exact hour of her death. The burial book at St. John Wapping has her entered on the 23rd of November in the year 1878, and the death was ordinary, the failure of the body of a woman past 80. There is no note of the cause. There is no note of the person who paid for the burial. The parish did what the parish did in such cases, and put her in the common ground at the northern edge of the burial yard. 63 years on the shore had ended in a plot with no stone. Her name went into the register in a plain hand, and her years went in beside it, and the clerk moved to the next line. Come back down the alley with me. I want to say what became of the boy of 10 we watched at the old stairs in the summer of that same year. The stairs were not walled in the way the stairs at the temple had been walled. They stayed open, and the shingle at their foot stayed shingle, and a child who wanted a piece of coal off the tide could still get one there, and a few of them did. but the number of them on any morning had fallen, and the number would go on falling. The boy does not, as far as I can find, ever get his own line in a census by the trade of mudlark. The return of 1881 has, for the whole of the parish of St. John Wapping, 4 persons under the trade of mudlark, and the youngest of them is a boy of 13, and the eldest is a woman of 72. The return of 91 has 1, a woman of 69, and the return of 1901 has none. Between the year we began this night and the year the Queen died, the trade had gone out of the census of the parish altogether. That does not mean that no one was working the shore. What it means is that the enumerators had stopped writing the word down. The clerks of the parish were told that the trade did not exist, and a clerk who put a mudlark in the return was told to put a different word, and the different word was labourer, or scavenger, or, in the case of a child, scholar, even where the child was not at school. This is one of the sad kindnesses of the state at the end of a century, that it will look at a thing and refuse to see it. The people were still there. What had gone was the record of them. There were children on the shore at Wapping in the 90s. There were children on the shore at Rotherhithe. There were children on the shore at Bermondsey until the great flood tides of 97 took away the last of the working shingle at the corner where the tributary of the River Neckinger came out into the Thames. And there were children on the shore at Deptford until the Trinity House works of 99 walled the last of that stretch off too. The word mudlark was gone from the returns. The thing that the word had meant was slower to go, and it went in the same way the shore had gone, one alley at a time, one stretch of dressed granite at a time. Silas Roach, the dredgerman I sat with in his boat in the 6th hour, died at his cottage on Blackheath in 81. He was buried at Charlton, and his brother's widow paid for the stone, and it stands there still. I have looked at it. It reads only his name and his years, and the words, late of the Thames. That was, in the phrasing of the time, a compliment. It was what a family said of a man who had worked the river when the river had been a thing men worked. Sergeant Meakin had gone before him. He died in the spring of 80, at Poplar, of the same cold on the chest that had troubled him through the last 5 winters he had spent on duty. He had not lived to see the wall at the foot of the old stairs finished, though he had seen the plan of it in the office at 259 Wapping High Street. His widow buried him at St. Anne Limehouse, where his father had been buried before him. She joined him 3 years later. Thomas Halligan, whose letter to the vestry we read in the last hour, I cannot follow with any confidence. The burial in the churchyard of St. Mary Lestrande in 72 might be his. It might not. There is another Thomas Halligan in the Camberwell Workhouse book in 84 who is of the right age, and there is another in a coroner's return of 89, drawn from the river at Waterloo Bridge, whose age at death was given as 59, and whose trade was given as none. That last one might be him too. The record does not close on him. He is one of the men the century simply lost. Come up now to a different room. It is in the workhouse infirmary at Poplar, and the year is 1904. The bed I want you to sit beside belongs to a woman called Elizabeth Whistle. She was born, so far as the workhouse master could gather from her, in the year of the coronation of the Queen, which would have made her 67 that winter. She had come into the house in the previous summer, having been found sleeping in a churchyard at Bromley by Bow. She was, when the master went through the forms with her, quite clear that she had worked the shore at Limehouse Reach from the age of 5, and that her mother had worked it before her, and that she had never done any other trade. The master had put her down as a labourer, because the form did not have a line for what she said she had been. When the almoner asked her, some months later, what she wanted done with her when she died, she said she wanted to be taken down to the river. The workhouse did not do that. The workhouse buried her in the common ground of the East London Cemetery in the spring of 1905, and the almoner wrote in the ledger that the deceased had expressed a wish concerning her burial that could not, in the nature of the case, be carried out. It is a brief entry, and it is the closest thing the record gives us to a last word from a Victorian mudlark. She was one of the youngest of the trade of the middle of the century, and one of the last of the trade of any part of the century, and her wish was that the river should have her back. It did not have her back. There were, past her, 1 or 2 more, though I cannot name them with any certainty. A photograph exists, taken by a man called Paul Martin, who worked the streets of London with a hand camera in the middle of the 90s, of an old woman on the shore at Blackwall, with a piece of sacking round her shoulders and a basket at her side. Martin gave no name in his notes, and the woman is turned 3/4 away from the lens, and it is not certain that she is a mudlark rather than a beachcomber of the sort that had begun by then to work the shore for coal alone. But she is bent to the shingle in the old way, and she is dressed in the clothes of an old woman of the 40s who had not bought a new coat since. I would like her to have been a mudlark. I do not know that she was. Come with me back to the water, because the water is where this story has always ended. The reach of the river between London Bridge and the Tower had, by the year the Queen died, 3 cast-iron walls and 1 long wharf of dressed stone standing between the alleys and the water. The sound the tide made on those walls was not the sound the tide had made on the shingle. It was a slap and a hiss, and it was made and unmade twice a day and left nothing behind. The seagulls that had followed the mudlarks along the rack line in the 50s still came in on the ebb, but they came into the wharves for the scraps of the men working the barges, and not to the shore for the small things the tide had turned up. The trade had gone. The gulls had adjusted. The river had not noticed either way. I want to be careful of one thing, and I want to say it before the last of this hour. The mudlarks were not, in their own eyes, a piece of the picturesque. They were not, in their own eyes, a chapter in a book. They were people who were hungry and who worked the shore because the shore was where the work was, and who would have done another work if another work had been open to them. It is easy, at 150 years' distance, to fold them into the poetry of the city. They were not poetry to themselves. They were cold most mornings, and they were tired most evenings, and the piece of bread they were paid for at the rag shop was the point of the whole thing. What we owe them is not a poem but a record. That is why I have tried to name them where the record has kept their names, and to say plainly where it has not. There is one more thing I would like to set down before we close. It is not from a book. I have been down the flight of steps that leads from Wapping High Street to the shingle at the foot of the old stairs, and the stairs are the same stairs. The wall to the west of them is a wall Mrs. Fowler would have known. The shingle at their foot is a strip of about 20 yards by 5 yards of pebbles and river silt. It was low water. The wind was coming up the reach from the east, and the smell of the river was the smell it had always been, of tar and cold water, and the sweetness of something further out. I bent down at the rack line and I picked up what the last tide had left there. There was a piece of clay pipe stem, white and cool. There was a small brown pebble that had once been the bottom of a bottle. There was a nail. I put them back where I had found them. They were not mine to keep. That is where I want to leave you. The tide is going out on the reach at Wapping. There is no child on the shingle now, and there is no old woman at the rack line, and the wall behind them is 150 years old and going quietly green in patches at its foot. The river takes what it always took, and it gives back what it always gave, and there is no one there to gather it. That was the end of the trade of the Victorian Mudlarks. It ended not with an Act of Parliament, and not with a proclamation. It ended with the last of the old women going into the ground, one after another, in the plots of the parish yards. It ended in the alleys off Nightingale Lane, in rooms whose windows looked out over water that was no longer theirs to work. The candles in the room where I have been sitting have burned low. The window is dark. The bells of the church across the road are striking a small hour of the morning, and the sound of them is the sound the bells of St. Magnus struck in the hook of this night. At the beginning of the tide we have followed. The river has carried on. The people of the shore have gone, and history, once again, turns the page in the dark.